welcome to another panel of Race in the 21st Century. Today we have guests with us from the Community Education Project here to speak with you about the work that they've been doing at Stetson University, as well as Tomoka Correctional Facility in Daytona Beach. Is that correct? Yep, awesome. So we're going to hear from our panelists today. As a reminder, this is a cultural credit eligible event. And so about 15 minutes before the end of our presentation today, a link will be posted in the chat box for students to fill out, and you'll have until the end of day today to complete that cultural credit form. Also a reminder, you are asked to provide your comments in the chat box. And so that is an interactive element of our conversation today. Our panelists are welcome to also look in the chat box. They know that if you post something in the chat, they will respond to it. If a chat comment doesn't get responded to, I'm happy to respond to that or bring that up in conversation. And so do feel free to ask your questions in the chat box, but we do ask that all of the audience members do mute yourselves just for the functionality of the panel. So that's where you can kind of place your comments. So without taking too much more time, I want to go ahead and allow our panelists today to go ahead and introduce themselves.
Hello, good evening or good afternoon. My name is Dr. Pamela Capastoro. I am a co-founder, one of the co-founders and co-directors of the Community Education Project, and I am an associate professor of world languages and cultures.
Good afternoon. My name is Andy Eisen. I teach in the history department and am the assistant director of the honors program. I'm also a co-director of Community Education Project and work as the on-site coordinator for the project. So prior to the pandemic, most of my work actually would happen at Tomoka Correctional Institution 4 or 5 days a week.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Melinda Hall. I teach in the philosophy department, and I'm very proud to be a co-director of the program along with the other wonderful people you see here.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Sarah Kramer. I am in the Environmental Science and Studies department, but I teach in the Sustainable Food Systems program, and I have been involved with CEP since 2018.
Hi everyone, my name is Nelson Quesada, and I'm a senior here at Stetson University with a double major in political science and English, and I'm also an intern with the Community Education Project as a member of the Bonner program.
Well, thank you all for that great introduction. So I just kind of want to just get started with the first question, and that is, what is CEP? And you know, how did this program come about? And what do we need to know that we wouldn't know about CEP?
Sure, so I will take that question, Dr. Jackson. So CEP started as a reading group in 2015. It was a migration and mobility reading group with Dr. Eisen, Dr. Petrovic, and myself. And since its inception, we've been, like you mentioned, in Daytona Beach. As of today, more than 40 faculty members, staff, and volunteers of Stetson are going to the program to facilitate classes or workshops over there. And in terms of like our program, we became a credit-bearing project in 2018. Our students now take Stetson credit courses, and their learning experience is the same one, liberal art experience, that students at the DeLand campus have. Our students are also engaged in research agendas, They have presented their research in local, regional, national, and international conferences. And yeah, we're very excited to talk a little bit more about what's been happening with the project since 2015, but also the evolution and all of that today.
Thank you for that, Dr. Capastoro. So I would say if you could talk, maybe about what it is to teach in these different environments. What's different about what happens for those students on the inside and those students on the outside, so to speak, because both of these students, the students on campus here at Stetson and the ones in Tomoka, are Stetson students. They earn Stetson credit. And so I would love to hear about sort of what is that interaction like? How does it differ? And in what ways is it just exactly like any other kind of classroom environment?
I think all of us probably have a lot of answers to this, and I'll just briefly say one thing that I think is so interesting and points to some of the unique ways that our program has operated given limitations. Probably you could guess that our students do not have access to the internet. However, over time, we were able to build lab with space for them to do word processing and things like that. We've also worked with national organizations like Ithaca through JSTOR on getting access to databases for students who are doing research. However, and this is the thing that's interesting, we do like a human ILL activity. When they want to engage in research, they may let us know a topic or let us know a series of articles. We pass that along to folks in our organization who then go and retrieve those articles and bring them in a hard copy. And that whole process and procedure and the very sort of nuanced and delicate way we have to make that happen, I think speaks to just some of those really unique elements of our program. But that said, there's a lot about teaching at Tomoka that is not different from teaching at Stetson on the main campus.
Other experiences?
I can respond to this. So in the summer of 2019, I taught my Introduction to Food Studies class that I teach every single semester at Stetson. I taught that at Tomoka. And yeah, like Dr. Hall said, in a lot of ways, it's very similar. You know, students are interested in talking about the same topics, but we do a group research project. Normally, when I teach this on the DeLand campus, the semester-long project is a group project, and that experience of adapting that class to the Tomoka setting really made me reevaluate a lot of my teaching on the DeLand campus. So I did not do that project as a group project because I can't assume that students at Tomoka live in the same dorm and that they can work together outside of class. I can't assume that it's safe for them to collaborate in a group project outside of the Stetson classroom. So there's a lot of assumptions that we kind of bring to the DeLand classroom about students being able to work together outside of class or students having access to resources. And so that experience really made me reevaluate some of those assumptions. Another thing that was really useful in kind of rethinking my pedagogy, especially because I'm now teaching the food studies class online this semester, which is, you know, another kind of dramatic pedagogical shift. Normally I bring food to that class and we do lots of hands-on experiential things, and we go to the campus garden and we do all sorts of hands-on learning because food is a very sensory experience. And so I couldn't do that. I couldn't bring food into the Tomoka classroom to try food with students. And so that led to a lot of really, really rich discussions about the symbolic role of food in our lives and, you know, the role of food in the prison setting. And one thing that's really timely, because this is the unit that we are in the food studies class this week in the semester, is the industrialization of food. And so one of the things that we analyze is Soylent, which is this like new meal replacement thing. And so the question is this a food and is this an industrial food? And so I was allowed to bring a bottle of Soylent into the prison, but I couldn't bring like a salad that I made to share with students. And so that led to a lot of great discussion about like, what even is food? What does it mean that some food is welcome in the prison if we don't think of it as food? And so anyway, that was just a few of my kind of reflections, but it's made me a more thoughtful teacher on the DeLand campus because of that process of reevaluating assumptions and thinking critically about learning outcomes and the learning space, and just respecting and bringing students' lived experiences with all of the topics into the classroom in new and thoughtful ways.
And just to provide one more additional example of kind of what is a little bit distinct about working inside of the prison, and specifically how we've developed our program as a single cohort model. So we have some students who have been in the program for all 5 years that we've been at Tomoka. It's a small cohort. We have about 22 students. But being a single cohort model that allows students to stay in the program for as long as they wish has also opened up opportunities that sometimes we don't get at the DeLand campus. So for the last 2.5 years, I've been able to work with students on a history project that is exploring, it came out of a guest lecture that I was giving about public history in Volusia County. And I think this may connect to some of the larger questions of race that we will want to get into as well. I was presenting about how poorly public history is provided to folks in Volusia County, and specifically at the De Leon Spring State Park, which was the Spring Garden Plantation, the site of arguably one of the largest slave revolts in American history. And that information is completely absent at De Leon Springs. And I brought this information to students. And they were just kind of enraged by that, that why don't more people know the histories of the land in which they reside? And so for the last 2.5 years, students have been studying and doing research on histories of slavery and Indian removal in Volusia County. They created a traveling exhibit on some incredible research that they've done at De Leon Springs State Park. There's a plaque, or not a plaque, it's a panel that was created sometime in the early 1990s that says the names of the enslaved persons are long forgotten. Our students have recovered more than 200 names of people who were enslaved at that plantation, and have dedicated their work into the memories of those folks who were enslaved there. And so we don't get that chance necessarily on the DeLand campus to take one project with a group of students over the course of more than a semester. And this really opens up different ways to work with students. And we have students who have published on this project. They presented at national conferences, the Making and Unmaking Mass Incarceration Conference last year at the University of Mississippi. And so they're engaged with the world in some really incredible ways.
I mean, thank you, Dr. Eisen. That is really interesting on so many different levels. So sort of just talking about length of time with the students, how long do your students end up staying in a class or with an instructor?
So that's pretty contingent. We do have some circumstances, and then we also have like an admission cycle once a year since we started doing credit-bearing courses. So I would say probably the average amount of time that someone is in CEP is 3 years, but that's a very changing and highly contingent number. And I think that most folks have taken classes with or workshops with everyone who volunteers with CEP. I mean, there's just this wonderful community around CEP. And so they'll have been with each of us in various formats in the classroom, regardless of if there's a 4-credit course from that particular professor. So I think there was more tied up in your question, but I just wanted to note that it's varied, really strongly varied.
I think what's part of that question too is also to think about the environment, the institutional environment of the student. So I'm curious, and this also ties to a question I have about the lived experience of these students, right? So I suppose I think, are these students who are incarcerated for a few years? Are they looking at longer periods of time? And this kind of gets to something that popped up in the chat. So are these students able to earn an actual degree? It looks like the answer's coming through. No. And so that's my question too, because in theory, if let's say someone, and I don't know how long these students are expected or generally stay, inside the prison, but if you have a student who's there for 6 years, for example, we would not normally have a student with us for that many years. Would they be allowed to kind of continue? So I guess I gave 2 questions. So one is sort of, I guess, does address that question of degree. What happens when you have a student for a long time? What happens when you have a student for a short time? They're only there for a year. What goes on with that student? And then I guess the second question, which we could talk about later, I could bring back around, is that lived experience, really, which gets to some of that. I think both Dr. Kramer and Dr. Eisen's examples of some of the work that they've been doing with students.
So a really great question. It really varies, as Dr. Hall mentioned. We have folks who were in for as little as 1.5 years or 2 years. And then on the other end of the spectrum, about maybe 40% of our students currently have life sentences. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be incarcerated for the rest of their lives. It just means that's what it says at this moment. The question that you bring up also kind of raises some additional ways in which teaching in the prison is distinct from Stetson. One of the challenging aspects of this project is that we have no control over whether a student can stay in the project, right? Outside of welcoming them to the classroom for as long as they would like, there are, of course, institutional ways in which students are removed from the classroom, legitimate and otherwise. So folks who are released, or they are transferring to a lower level security prison that is closer to their home so they can see their family members more frequently. To those folks who are accused of using a cell phone and therefore are moved to a different institution. So there's a lot of kind of ways in which we can't control exactly or know from week to week, or to have any assurances that students will be able to come back. But by and large, folks, once they're enrolled in the program, continue in the program and want to be in the program for as long as they're incarcerated.
Thank you for that explanation. And I think that helps clarify, and the chat seems to be going with a number of questions regarding the types of courses that can be, that are happening. What about COVID-19? I think that's an interesting thing. So there's a lot of interest in sort of, what does this look like, right? What does the classroom space look like inside a prison? And then I guess in some ways, I'll go back to that question. And then who are your students, right? Who do you tend to see in the classroom? And I am going to say, are we dealing with, it's an all male population? Is that correct to understand that?
Well, I mean, there are also trans women who are incarcerated at Tomoka, not currently enrolled in our program, but it is designated as an all-male prison.
Oh, okay. All right. And then are these students of any particular racial and or ethnic background? Do you see a concentration of African Americans, Latinx, so forth?
Yeah, so in terms of our student body, we have, it varies, but right now, I will say that like around 60-something% of the classroom, African American and Latinx, and the rest of the students are white students. So that's kind of like the composition of the classroom right now. But in terms of like the compound, we don't have those numbers.
So in the classroom itself, I'm sorry, just to restate that, you're saying 50, about half of the students are white, and then the other half Latinx?
We'll say like 60 or 55% Latinx and African American, and then the rest of the students are white students.
I see. So a little more, but this would not necessarily be reflective of the demographic of the entire institution. Gotcha. All right. So just also curiosity as to who ends up in the classroom, who has this opportunity even within an institution, because there's always issues of access and privilege. And I can certainly imagine taking college classes as some type of a privilege in that kind of setting, right? COVID-19, looks like there's a conversation about that, teaching in a prison with COVID-19.
So I can start, and I'm sure everyone here can discuss the ways in which their work with the Community Education Project has changed as a result of COVID. For me, most directly, I was spending about 20 hours or 25 hours a week at the prison. When COVID hit, we were no longer able to enter the prison for safety reasons, and still are unable to return. And so our work has all changed. We've done a lot of, have put a lot of effort into trying to finish up the classes that students were enrolled in the spring. We're working with the professors. Unfortunately, one of the classes was a computer science course, and we just can't complete that class because students need to be writing code on the computers, and we can't get them into the library. We can't bring the professor in. The other course, Dr. Rust was teaching in the philosophy department, and he has found a way to complete the course through correspondence, which we're really excited about, and really proud to be working with folks who are so dedicated to CEP students, and have gone above and beyond to try and accommodate them given these challenging circumstances. But I'm sure there's 100 different ways we could talk about how COVID has impacted our work.
Yes, I guess briefly, I was kind of like supporting, especially during Fridays, right? Like I will be over there bringing visitors that will offer workshops in Tomoka. So now that I don't have that role, we move towards re-entry efforts. So that means that with the re-entry team, we've been working since the summer to try to come up with a re-entry guide for people that are getting released. So that's kind of like the work that my mini working group has been putting the efforts on re-entry, and also a position for re-entry that we are in the process of finishing, right? So adding another team member that can help us with the re-entry efforts of the project that were not necessary. That part of the project was not necessarily like developed, and now we are developing that.
So can you speak a little bit? Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Hall. I just wanted clarification on re-entry. Sorry. Yes.
Yes, so re-entry, right? Like people that are getting released, we're thinking about these processes way before our students get out, right? Because things like birth certificate, identifications, these are things that are very critical, but that people that are incarcerated, they don't have those, right? So how can we support in finding these documents? How we can help people thinking about housing, right? That is one of the many issues that people have. Thinking about finding jobs, preparation for jobs, right? Like all of these things, we are trying to, with the reentry guide, help people to think about this, all of these elements, right, that are so essential for people that once they get out, right, like hopefully this work can help them. because people think that once you get released, you enter to the society like nothing, and that's not the case, right? Because Florida has many, many laws in place that prevents people that have been incarcerated from finding housing, finding employment. There's a lot of collateral consequences, right? So hopefully with the reentry guide, we can educate, and prepare some of the people, right? Like the documents that they might need, the job laws that currently are in Florida that might protect them, right, when they are looking for jobs. So all of these things we have been kind of like working since summertime together.
Thank you for that clarification. Dr. Hall.
Just very briefly, I think that it's worth saying that when COVID hit, we were terrified for our students and devastated to be moved out of the prison. Dr. Eisen can say more about this as he was most deeply impacted by the shift. And he's already mentioned it a little bit, but we weren't able to find out what was happening. And we didn't know when we were going to go back. And we still talk all the time about when are we going to go back. There's so much uncertainty, and there's already so much uncertainty in this work and so much outside of our control that that's been very difficult. So I wanted to register or mention that this has been a very difficult time for the entire team, and we have pivoted, but I think that it's worth mentioning that. And then I also wanted, because our student intern hasn't spoken yet, I wanted to invite him to say, because I think he has a very different sort of experience since COVID. I mean, not different from before, but different from us, from faculty who are on site, and it would be cool to hear what he might say.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hall. So a lot of the work that I have done has been within the past year to plan a conference that CEP wants to have for next year. And this conference, the focus of the conference is to be on Florida prisons, and not just on higher education in prison, but also showcasing CP student scholarship, as well as the state of Florida prisons in the age of COVID. So that last point is interesting because originally, before COVID, we wanted to have this conference be an in-person conference where we could have conference attendees go into the prison and engage in conversations with the current CEP students, so we could have the CEP students be part of the conference as well, because we didn't want to exclude them at all, right? With COVID, clearly that's something that we're not going to be able to do, and so we've transitioned to have the conference be completely online. And so in terms of the work that I do, that's been the biggest sort of challenge for me, because I don't go into the prison. A lot of the work that I do is on capacity building for the program. And because of this conference planning that I've been doing, it took a lot of planning to see how we could transition an in-person conference that we had mostly laid out the framework for into completely online format. So that's been a big challenge for me, I would say.
Thank you, Nelson. I'm curious, so what brought you to want to work with the CEP? What motivated you or inspired you?
Yeah, so as a Bonner student, we are asked to have a site where we spend most of our time working at to see how we can help the community. Before being in CEP, I was a tutor at the local high school, Lillian High School, in a college prep program. And the spring of my sophomore year, I attended an all-call that the Bonner program put up that was dealing with CEP's current work. And the two CEP interns who were also Bonner students at the time, since by the way, were leading the discussion and showing the work that they had been doing in their time at CEP. And I was just really inspired by that, especially because I didn't have a lot of knowledge about mass incarceration and how it disproportionately affects Black and Brown individuals. And learning all of this in that 1 hour and 30-minute meeting, I was just really taken aback by everything that I heard about, and I really wanted to get involved. And so I would say that that is the turning point for me that led me to want to be a part of CEP. And so I reached out to Dr. Petrovic, who's also part of CEP, and asked her if I could join, and I was accepted. And so I'm really happy with the work that I've been doing here and with the incredible support of the CEP professors.
Thank you, Nelson. One last question for you, Nelson. So what year student are you?
I'm a senior.
Yes, and so how will this experience propel you into the future? What are your plans next?
Yeah, so I'm considering to attend graduate school and get a PhD in political science. Now, I have a lot of different interests that I would like to research, including public opinion and political behavior. But the one thing that I've always been drawn to in political science is how to get people to change their minds about issues. And I did research on that in the summer with something else, different issue. But that's something that I want to continue doing in my graduate studies. And as it relates to CP, with the work that I've done here, I'd be really interested in looking at how within the political science discipline, I could get people, the mass public, to be more accepting of progressive reforms to the criminal justice system, because the current system as it stands is, as I mentioned before, discriminatory, and it affects Black and Brown individuals disproportionately, and just the entire carceral state is a big problem that needs to be fixed. And I think that political science as a field is one where I'd be able to measure public opinion and see what changes public opinion on how the public views these reforms, as well as incarcerated individuals. So that's what I hope to do in the future.
Thank you, Nelson. I think it's always interesting to sort of think about what motivates us to sort of engage in certain kinds of work, especially for you all as students out there. And you can choose to participate in any kinds of community projects, and having one that's centered and focused on incarceration, but also helping people, right? So there's the institution itself, right? The prison, industrial, prison system complex, and all of the ways in which mass incarceration impacts and affects our communities. But then there's also the people, the students, and how we may also see that kind of in contrast, is education sort of a kind of freedom, right? A freedom that can be imagined in a space, in an institutional space, that isn't about freedom. But something else that's kind of come up in this conversation is, in thinking about Dr. Cabas-Toro talking about reentry. Reentry brings up this issue of people moving back into the community. And so when someone is committed an infraction, and again, as a reminder, I'm a sociologist, so I think about our society, and there are formal norms and informal, and when you break laws, norms that have been codified as law, you're going to have a consequence, and some of those sanctions lead you into prison. And in some ways, I think in the stories of many people, that's the end of it. And people being people in, the broad, or those in power, right? You've broken the rules, you have to leave the society, and in some ways you may stay trapped with that kind of stigma. But the reality is, especially when we talk about mass incarceration, this is something that's happening, the incarceration of our population. We have the largest incarcerated population out of any nation in the world, yet we don't have the largest population, right? So how do we come to make sense of that? And then what is the impact of incarceration on families, on individuals, on particular communities? So we cannot say incarceration is the end of a person's life. No, we must think about how do we reintegrate these individuals back into our society. And so I think it's interesting that you're thinking about ways of reentry, but I also want to take, I want to think about this question that you all have been working on, and that is this question of what can an institution like Stetson, but specifically what can Stetson do as an institution, but an institution of higher education, do to lead that work of reintegration, where we don't just say, hi, you violated the law and we are done with you as a member of society. What responsibility, what leadership, what work can we do here at Stetson to be part of that change? So I'd be curious to hear more about sort of the Stetson side of the issues.
I think that I can start to frame this conversation, Dr. Jackson, because I feel that it's important. So I think that us as an institution, right, Stetson University, will have to think about how our policies could be an extension of the carceral state, right, and how we can help to challenge that, right? So for instance, when we think about employment, and the protocols that might be in place for Stetson University, right? Like how we as a university can think about the policies that are in place and how that impacts people with criminal records, right? Because Stetson is not the only institution, right, that have policies, you know, hiring policies that might impact people with criminal records. This is something that happens across many universities and other you know, institutions. So I think that the first step will be for Stetson to rethink the current hiring policies that are existing.
Thank
and
you.
then too, I mean, oh, sorry, Dr. Kramer.
I was just going to follow up on what Dr. Capistoro said, that I think it raises some bigger questions about how we think about the role of prisons in our society. So I see a lot of our honor students here. So Dr. Eisen, Dr. Capistoro, and I are teaching an FSEM this semester on prisons and society. And so we are wrestling with some of these same questions. But if we think that prisons serve a rehabilitative purpose in our society, if bad people go to prison and then they are rehabilitated and then they are released, why then are they required to check a box on an application for employment or for admission to a university? And so I think that when you get into those questions, it raises larger questions about what are prisons actually accomplishing, and if we believe that they are serving this purpose, then why don't our policies for people upon release reflect that? So that was just kind of where my brain went as Dr. Capistoro was talking about Stetson certainly not being the only example of an institution with potentially discriminatory policies like this, but rather reflective of broader issues in our society.
Dr. Hall, did you want to add to that?
I'm typing up a storm in the chat, but yes, I think that what I wanted to say was about the admissions processes, just to add a little bit about the probation period that we tend to do of 1 year, and other elements that I'm becoming more aware of over time as we work to consider how Stetson students in CEP upon release may come to our main campus. And I think that there's a huge opportunity for leadership here related to questions of risk management. And that's super interesting to me as a philosopher. What counts as risk? How do we understand risk? Who's risky? Who presents risk? And I think we're making a lot of case-by-case decisions that end up becoming de facto policy. And we need to be able to have that de facto policy come into conversation so that we can figure out if it's serving us. And I believe that it isn't. And so we need to discuss that. But until we discuss it, until we talk about what that de facto policy is that comes of case by case consideration, we can't sort of move forward. So I'm interested in seeing Stetson be willing to discuss further some of our de facto policies around admissions.
And just to kind of take one step back, and I see you unmuted, Nelson. I'll just give you 1 second. Just to take one step back, we understand that our project, we're working with students who are not traditional students. When Stetson was founded in the late 1800s, the founders of this university did not imagine a college that would be offering its credits to people who are incarcerated. Times change. This was once an all-white institution until the early 1960s. All white in terms of faculty and students. Of course, people of color always labored here, but weren't allowed to enter. And so I think when we understand that the expansion of what we are calling mass incarceration or the carceral state, this happened with the in conjunction with university policies, right? These things can't be torn apart from one another. The policies that are in place that restrict folks from getting employment here or becoming students here are contributing to mass incarceration. And I think it's incumbent upon us to figure out ways in which we can change policies here locally. In fact, I've been really encouraged by some students on campus who have been starting a Ban the Box campaign. I want to share in the chat a great draft of a document that they've been working on, research that they've been compiling concerning how these policies impact people, as well as the ways that risk are imagined. And so I'm just going to post that in the chat box and thank the students for all of their excellent work.
Oh, thank you for that. As you post the work on Ban the Box, it would just help if we could get a little bit of an explanation as to what you mean by Ban the Box. And I do also want to announce you've just been joined. I think Dr. Petrovic just arrived. You can go ahead and open your video if you're here, and we'd be happy to have you contribute as well. Okay, so Ban the Box, what is that?
Yes, please. Well, essentially,
Nelson.
yes, Nelson.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So real quick context. Towards the end of the summer, when I was working as part of my internship with CAP, I joined a working group that looked at what potential changes we could institute at Stetson in regards to current policies, right? And something that I started looking into was, as has been made clear in this conversation, that Stetson currently has a policy that asks applicants if they have ever been convicted of a felony, a misdemeanor, or any other type of crime. It also asks a question on past disciplinary behavior in terms of other academics, such as high school suspension or college suspension. But since the focus here is on incarceration, I want to focus specifically on that question. So to answer your question, Dr. Jackson, Ban the Box is essentially a movement that has occurred in different areas across the country, not just in higher education and prison, but also in employment sectors as well. But in regards to the higher education sector, there have been institutions that have completely done away with asking any of their applicants of if they have ever been convicted of any felonies, misdemeanors, or crimes. And the rationale for that is because, you know, there's a concern that questions like these limit access to individuals who want to pursue an education, a higher education. Uh, and it's especially concerning when we take into account, as I mentioned previously, how mass incarceration disproportionately affects Black and Brown individuals. So what I decided to do was work with a number of other students, Stetson students, mostly first year students actually, to review that particular policy. And we have had a couple of conversations with members of administration to dig deeper and to get a clearer picture on how that existing policy works. Um, and so we're still going to be continuing to have conversations, and we're still in the data gathering process of it. But essentially what I can say is that there seems to be a lot of sort of like discretion. It's very ad hoc in that sense that, you know, if someone checks the box, the application is sent to someone in the Dean of Students office, and then they review that application to gather more information about the context of the situation as to why this person was convicted of a felony, misdemeanor, or any other type of crime. And then they decide whether or not the application can move forward at admissions. As you can imagine, we're having ongoing conversations because, you know, we want to ensure that Stetson is being equitable with who it allows in to be a student, and that it's not restricting anybody who wants to have a access to higher education.
Thank you for that description, Nelson. It sounds like you guys have been doing a lot of really important work, sort of documenting all of these practices. Dr. Kramer, did you have a comment or? Oh, okay, that was just a hand.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that Nelson got to talk about it because he's really been a leader in that initiative, and we've been so impressed by the work that he's helped coordinate.
No, thank you for doing that. Thank you. And highlighting that work because it does sound like important work. So I think there was a couple of thoughts I had as you all spoke in that last round. And I am going to first sort of comment back, and Dr. Petrovic is only here to observe, fair enough. She has a young one with her. So I completely understand that. So welcome and thank you. And thank you for your contributions and hard work. We did have the privilege to hear about your contributions. So thank you. Dr. Eisen says, it sort of brings up when you talk about what the history of Stetson, right, as a predominantly white, formerly Baptist, right? So we have to have that, you know, bring into context this moralistic framework of what a Stetson education is. And so, and that really sort of makes me think, okay, so what is the role of Stetson? Dr. Hall says, you know, bringing up her own thinking as a philosopher, risk, right? So you've got sort of what the institution envisions and imagines itself, why the students come here. Maybe having the box is a problem, maybe it isn't. There was an interesting comment in the chat that made me think a little bit about sort of some of these kind of competing ideas. You know, what is Stetson? What is its culture, history, and where do we go? Do we have to be what we were? Or can we sort of step up into this new landscape that we're sort of facing? But Katie Kraft wrote in a comment a little earlier, I know higher education is a great way to mitigate the probability that a formerly incarcerated person returns to prison. However, most of this is due to the fact that a college degree increases one's desirability in the job market. So how can we work towards allowing Stetson students in the CEP program, whether released or not released, to pursue their degree? But I think this question really begs this other issue of mitigation, right? And again, that role the institution can play in helping people re-enter society. Education, for many Americans, the job market is a fluctuating job market. We see all kinds of people returning back to school as a way to remake their lives and remake who they are. Should we be in a position, should we take advantage of that opportunities to also meet these students who are coming to us with criminal records and also provide them those same kinds of opportunities? Or is that just something that's too risky?
So I have a couple things to say in response to this, but I'll keep it very brief because I've already spoken. But I just want to say that on the one hand, we try to be very cognizant of the fact that what we're doing when we're in that space is hopefully like pulling or releasing power out from the traditional campus and making sure that we have impact outside the walls of our regular classrooms. Like, we do want to basically acknowledge that we have power and then we're trying to like share it or get it released or something like that out into the larger community, including those who are incarcerated. But I do want to mention that we're also like very concerned or careful about like the language of transcendence or like freedom out of the space, because we can't offer that. We are, by doing education in that space, sometimes interfering, sometimes making problems, sometimes we have to really think about what we're doing in that space. And Dr. Kramer mentioned that as well in her remarks about, well, we don't know what's going to happen in the dorm later with regard to some of the topics that we brought. And so we are thinking all the time about how to conceptualize education as a human right and why we do what we do and the work that we do without necessarily like making a claim that we're providing freedom through our actions, because that feels inaccurate, first of all, and then also like maybe like a narrative that needs to be interrupted. And so I just wanted to briefly say that, but I think that the stakes are really clear from what you said, Dr. Jackson. Like, these various like institutions have like, so TMOCA and the DOC across the state has the desire to see like behavior mitigation. They want us to reach as many people as possible because they see people in CEP as being more well-behaved, and they want everyone to like, they want like us to triple the size of our program at any time. And then we have the stakes from Stetson of wanting to have like a successful program and match our values and things like that. So it's always really difficult, really hard to balance all of these things.
And if I could just take a few minutes, I would love to have an opportunity to read something that one of our students wrote that speaks to this in a roundabout way about the purpose of education that goes beyond liberation, in that he has a life sentence. And he's been working on the history project for the last 2 years. I saw he worked very closely with Madison Creech to do a lot of the design work on the exhibit, which we wanted to show last year, but COVID, and hopefully we'll have opportunities to bring that work out into the world. But I want to read this piece. It'll take me about maybe 3 minutes or so, from Antonio, writing about kind of what he's learned through doing the history project. He writes, according to Marissa Fuentes, the author of Dispossessed Lives, enslaved persons are silenced in the archives by the narrative told by their recorders. They are not allowed to tell their own stories. The, quote, violent systems and structures of white supremacy created devastating images, end quote, of enslaved people that erased them and led to their social death. What we can know about them is limited by what and how those in power decided to document about them. In a previous paper for the ASH conference, I mentioned that I was drawn to the Public History Research Collective because of the similarities between enslavement and modern incarceration. Thinking of the likeness within the context of Marissa Fuentes' discussion of the archives has led me to explore a deeper motivation for partaking in this project, my desire to buck against the narrative imposed on me by the penal system. Since my incarceration 2 decades ago, my footprint on society has ceased. Instead, my life has been lived within the legal and correctional archives. The legal archive began with my arrest report and my mugshot. I then made a brief appearance in the court records. Since then, certain aspects of my life have been documented on my contact card, a record of minor infractions kept in my dormitory's officer station, and disciplinary record within the Florida Department of Corrections database. The department does not record positive activities other than educational and vocational programs from which lifers are largely excluded. My achievements as a self-directed learner and my personal growth are completely ignored by these archives. I have heard of prisoners stand before parole and clemency boards with squeaky clean disciplinary records and shiny resumes of program completions only to have those achievements considered suspect. As a convicted felon serving life sentences, how will my story be told by historians searching through available records decades from now? As a lifer, it is expected that I will not have anything meaningful to contribute to society or academia. The Florida Department of Corrections suspects that men like me are either violent gang members. Up until earlier this year, I was listed as a member of a security threat group because of a sergeant's claim that I admitted membership to him, or a drug user. The department routinely administers random drug tests. My decision to avoid drug use, violence, and gang membership are directly related to my desire to define my identity against the expectations of corrections professionals. My pursuit of higher education through self-directed studies and now as a Stetson CEP student is integral to my self-definition. My submissions for academic conferences, article for process history, and work on the Public History Research Collective's exhibit on the Spring Garden Plantation are opportunities to leave my own trace in academic and public archives that expand the narratives that may be told about me in the negative legal and correctional archives. While I can't extricate myself from the prison industrial complex, I am challenging the narratives that are propagated by it.
Oh, I'm so glad you shared that with us, Dr. Eisen. I think it's really very powerful, especially in hearing someone's own story, right? And so many of us struggle to have our own story told through our own lens. And you can only really imagine when we become institutionalized, or a person becomes institutionalized, especially by a place like prison, how they may lose who they are, the sense of humanity, right? And I guess that gets to Dr. Hall's comment earlier too, right? So yeah, I mean, these are great. It looks like there's some positive feedback as well coming in the chat.
Dr. Jackson, I have a short little response to the comments that you were making about resisting institutionalization. I would say that my own learning since I started working with CEP, it's very easy to come in thinking that this is something else to study, or that prisons are a unique environment, and so as academics we are conditioned to be really inquisitive and to ask all of these questions about interesting people and interesting environments. And the entire framework of CEP rejects that and really pushes for co-construction of knowledge with students. And so what I've been able to do in supporting these academic researchers, I mean, I have students that have co-authored conference papers, and I have a student who he has a journal article that's accepted for publication with minor revisions, and we can't get him the revisions because of COVID, but just really remembering that all the time, like allowing a platform for people to tell their own story in their own voices, and that we can support that because of the resources that we have access to, but that our job is not to speak on their behalf or to represent them. And so I know when we were planning this panel, Dr. Eisen felt very strongly about sharing Antonio's words, and I think that really illustrates a lot of what we're talking about, like allowing the CEP students to define their own identities and then express that themselves.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm sorry, Dr. Kramer. So that is great that you sort of round that out and really give us something to think about and reflecting. And while there are some educators in this room who aren't teaching in a prison, we can all think about the ways in which we need to highlight and honor and let other people tell their stories, right? And respect those stories as truth. So I do want to, as we're winding down, I want to return to this sort of question of what do we do here at Stetson? How does Stetson step up and lead the way? And I heard some comments like, well, I'm not really super thrilled with all of the things that are happening here. We can do better. And so here is my question to you all. How could we do better? What would you love to see happening that is not happening?
So I think there's a number of things that we could address. I know one of the long-term goals of our program would be, as folks have written in the chat and asked about, is how can students at Tomoka earn degrees? I know that that's a question that our students are asking at Tomoka. You will not find a group that are more enthusiastic to be Stetson students than the folks at Tomoka. They love Stetson, and it's our hope that we can find ways to work with the administration and the university to turn this program into one where we can have a graduation ceremony one day at Tomoka.
I think that also moving forward, keep thinking about how Stetson can, stop being part of that carceral state expansion, right? Rethinking hiring practices of the institution. I think that's something that moving forward, it's a question that will be very useful for us to keep thinking and addressing.
And Dr. Capas-Toro, when you talk about hiring practice changes, would those be policies that are proactive policies to ensure fair hiring or non-discriminatory hiring on the basis of criminal record?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
And I would just extend that one step further and reiterate the conversation we were having about the boxes on admission applications, that I think hiring and admissions are obviously separate processes, but have the same sort of problems.
Yep, that's a very valid point there. Yes, and Dr. Hall?
And just one other point for those students in this room, it's really wonderful to have you here, and we take every opportunity we can to spread awareness about our program, because student interest in this program and they're feeling that this is a valuable program that expresses Stetson values and it's something they want to see as a student is really important for us as we promote and work and advocate for our program to become institutionalized at Stetson. So to support us, it can really help for you all to articulate this as something that you're glad Stetson does, and that you want to see continue. And that's true now, and it's true after you leave. And so I'm glad you're here.
And yeah,
And
Nelson?
I would quickly just say, I personally would encourage administrators at Stetson, those who really have power and say over policies, to be willing to engage in these conversations with us and with people who want to see policy changes at Stetson, and to be willing to learn about these subject matters and how mass incarceration impacts so many people disproportionately.
Oh, these are all great suggestions. So hopefully they went out into the community and the community will pick them up and carry them forward. There was one more comment from Dr. Everett in the chat, thanking you all, and asking, what about our college or university board members? Any support coming in from that direction?
Absolutely, yes. If we had more time, I think we could say more, but absolutely, we've had strong interest from board members in the program.
Okay, that's wonderful, right? So let's keep on pushing this wonderful work. And thank you to all of our panelists that came out today, everyone in the audience. This has been really very informative, and thank you for teaching us all about your work and what we all should be doing. All right, have a good rest of your afternoon. Thank you, everyone. If you haven't done the cultural credit, it is in the chat. So hopefully I'll give a couple minutes and then we're gonna end that.
Thank you for doing these, Dr. Jackson.
Oh yes, no, I enjoy them. I learn something new every time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson.
Yeah, no, you guys. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Dr.
for all of
Jackson.
your engagement. It makes it, I can do it by myself. It has to happen with you all. So
Appreciate all your work on this. Thank you.
yeah, no, you guys too. And hopefully this helps propel your work as well. So that will be fantastic. All righty, I'm gonna close it out. So have a good afternoon. Happy Friday. Bye.